Hello, I'm Sharon Genman. I'm a senior lawyer in the Corporate Finance Department specialising in public M&A. I'm joined by Hal Robinson, a partner in our Pensions Department, and Guy Norman, a corporate finance partner who also specialises in public M&A. Pension issues are increasingly significant on M&A transactions. Today we'll be focusing on the pension issues arising on a public takeover, particularly where the target has a defined benefit pension scheme. So Howell, what is a defined benefit pension scheme?
A defined benefit scheme is just a scheme where the benefits are fixed in advance. The employee is promised a particular level of pension that they're guaranteed to receive when they retire. You can contrast defined benefit and defined contribution schemes. With a defined contribution scheme, the amount you pay in is fixed, but you don't know what it's going to produce when you retire. It's all going to be invested. If the investments perform well, you'll get a high pension. If they perform badly, you'll get a low pension. With a defined benefit scheme, employees don't take those sorts of risks. If it turns out there isn't enough money to pay the benefits that have been promised, the employer just has to put in more.
Thank you. And so what are the key issues that arise on a takeover?
Well, probably the biggest issue is that a takeover or any other transaction can substantially increase the costs of a defined benefit pension scheme. Defined benefit schemes are supposed to be fully funded. They're supposed to have enough money to cover their liabilities. However, generally speaking, it's impossible to know in advance exactly what the liabilities will be. There are all sorts of variables you can't predict. You don't know how long people are going to live, how investments are going to perform, what inflation's going to be. Running a defined benefit pension scheme involves making assumptions about those sorts of things. Very broadly, in the UK, the assumptions that you make depend on the financial strength of the company. If you have an employer that's very financially sound, the trustees who run the scheme are allowed to be optimistic. They're allowed to make optimistic assumptions, and that'll make the pension liability look quite small. On the other hand, if you've got a weak employer who might not be around in the long term, trustees are pressured to be much more cautious, and the pension liability becomes much more expensive. A takeover can have a big impact on a company's financial strength. The most obvious example is if you come in and you increase debt levels within a company, it's going to weaken the company, and chances are that will have a substantial effect on the pension liability. It will make it more expensive.
Thank you. And what role does the pensions regulator have on a takeover?
Well, the regulator's got two key roles. First of all, they are the ultimate arbiters on funding. If an employer and trustees can't agree what assumptions to use, it's the regulator that gets to step in and adjudicate. Secondly, the regulator has a set of powers called the moral hazard powers. It's a bit of a misleading title, but they essentially are about piercing the corporate veil. They allow the pensions regulator to extend pension liabilities beyond employing companies. They can go after other group companies, they can go after shareholders, they can go after directors in some cases. If you are worried that a particular activity or a particular transaction might attract the attention of the regulator and put you in the frame, there is a clearance facility. You can apply to the regulator, get a binding clearance that they won't attack you. And that is most commonly how the regulator becomes involved in transactions, because the parties make a clearance application.
So can you describe the benefit of a bidder seeking clearance, and also a little bit about the process?
Yeah, sure. The direct benefits of clearance for a bidder are actually quite limited. It is possible for a bidder to get a clearance, but typically it'll be heavily caveated. It won't be something you can place much reliance on. The direct benefits are more for target company directors and potentially any large outgoing shareholders. There are, however, some indirect benefits. If you take over a company and you weaken it in the process, at some stage that's going to have an impact on funding. It's going to increase your costs, perhaps not immediately, but at some point in the future. If the parties make a clearance application, that will all be analysed up front. The trustees will assess the impact of the deal and what they think the funding ought to be. And some bidders might prefer that to be done up front so they can go into the deal with their eyes open. There are, however, process disadvantages. It can take about 4 to 6 weeks to get a clearance. It also can be a bit detrimental in terms of the deal you reach. If you try and reach a deal with trustees and the pensions regulator within the timescale of a takeover, you're giving them quite a lot of leverage. You're perhaps not reaching the best deal that you might.
Thank you. And Guy, is it possible to make pensions regulator clearance a condition of the bid?
No, it's not possible to make a takeover conditional on receiving pensions regulator clearance. And the reason for that is it's a voluntary procedure, as Hal's indicated, rather than a strict regulatory requirement. So if you do want the comfort of pension regulator clearance, you do have to obtain that comfort prior to committing to the transaction through a firm intention announcement. One interesting recent development is, of course, we've got the 28-day put up or shut up rule, which requires the target company to be supportive of any extension. And therefore, in practice, because of the time that it might take to get pensions regulator clearance, it's probable that the only circumstances in which you're going to be able to get that clearance prior to the firm intention announcement is when you've got a recommended situation and the target board will then comply with requests for an extension to that 28-day put up or shut up period.
Thank you. And are you able to give us a flavour of the recent Takeover Code changes extending rights to pension scheme trustees?
Yes, of course. Since May 2013, there have been new rules in the Takeover Code which require the bidder to comply with certain obligations. Firstly, the bidder has to provide pension fund trustees with the same information about the bid that they would have to provide to employees, namely, for example, access to bid documentation, bid announcements. The second key requirement is that the bidder has to provide the trustees with the opportunity to include in the offer document or have posted on a website their opinion on the impact of the offer on the target's defined benefit pension schemes, and in particular employer contributions, benefit accrual, and admission of new members. And then the third key change is that the bidder must now include in offer documentation a statement about its own intentions in relation to the offer's impact on those three areas. And these rules apply to all target pension funds where there's a defined benefit element, regardless of the materiality of the scheme, and indeed it covers UK schemes as well as overseas schemes on a group-wide basis for the target.
So how have these code changes impacted on market practice?
Well, since the changes came in, I think there have only been public offers in the UK for 3 companies where there were defined benefit pension schemes. And just looking at each of those in turn, on the ENRC bid, which is a hostile bid, the documentation contained very limited information in relation to pensions because the bidder didn't have access to the relevant information. On the bid for HRO, where there is a £1 million approximately pension deficit, there is a statement by the bidder that the target will continue to comply with its obligations in relation to pension fund contributions, etc. And then on the third of these bids, Schneider's bid for Invensys, the offer document hasn't yet been published, so we await that to see what information is in there. But I think, in general, it's clear that these changes are important, but they're not having a huge impact on the conduct of bids. I think it's also worth noting that it's important to consult the takeover panel in advance in relation to whatever disclosure it is that you're going to include in these situations.
We've prepared a briefing which covers these issues in more detail. This is available on the Global M&A Toolkit. Guy, Hal, thank you very much.